In this video, we're going to look at the task list application from this chapter that uses a lot of the code that we discussed in the previous video. So if you haven't watched that, make sure you watch it. The first thing I'm going to do is open up the file to demonstrate it. So I'm going to right click and open in my default browser, and it pops up with this. This page says, since the application relies on HTTP, and it does because we're using cookies, and remember, cookies are involved with HTTP requests. Okay, it only will work correctly when it's run on a web server. Now, I've uploaded mine to a web server, but there are plugins for Visual Studio Code that will let you install a small local web server to test this. If you're going to upload your code to Visual Studio or to GitHub, excuse me, if you want to upload your code to GitHub, you can test it that way, but it's going to take a while because if you remember when you upload files to GitHub pages, it takes a while, probably like 5 minutes sometimes, before the changes you made are actually reflected on the website. So that would be a very slow way to test. So in a follow-up video here, I might show you one of those plugins to run a local web server. But for me, for this demo, I've uploaded this application to my website, mrgeiger.com, and I have it up there, task list cookies. So I can demonstrate it running from a web server. Now, I wouldn't do it this way if I was developing because I don't want to have that lag when I make changes. But since I know this one already works, I'm okay. So how does this work? I type in a task like feed the dog, and I say add the task, and it goes onto my task list. Cut the grass, add task, it gets added onto my list. Clean the house, add task, gets added onto my list. I have a button here that lets me clear tasks, and it deletes all the stuff from the cookie. So that information is stored in a cookie, and it's actually stored for 21 days. If I would close this website and open it back up, let's test it. Clean the house. I'm going to put that task in here. I'm going to copy this so I don't have to retype it back in. But that task is now stored in a cookie on my computer. If I close my browser and I reopen it, and I type in that address, it still says clean the house because that was stored in a cookie on my local computer and it accessed it and retrieved it. Okay, so it's a persistent cookie. All right, so let's take a look at how this application works. I'll clear the tasks out of there. All right, so I have my main page here. It says task list. I have a div with an ID of tasks and a label of task list, and we can see the text area, 6 rows, 50 columns wide. That's this area right here. Okay. I have a label and a text input for the task I want to type in, and a couple buttons to add tasks and clear tasks. That's all that's there. And tasklist.js is where the magic happens. So let's take a look at that, and we'll see some code that we've seen before. First of all, we have a big comment up here that warning us that this won't work. It won't run correctly from Chrome or Firefox or maybe even other browsers. If you want it to work correctly, deploy it to a web server and run it from the web server. So we have seen this function before. We looked at it in the last video. It's the set cookie function that allows us to pass in a name for the cookie, a value for the cookie, and how many days we want the cookie to persist. So we saw that. I explained it in the last video. You can go back and look at that, but it basically does a bunch of concatenation to build the cookie up and then sets a cookie on our computer. Okay. We also saw this function before, get cookie by name, that lets us pass in the name for a cookie, and then it goes through and it attempts to find the start and the end of the cookie, and then pulls of the cookie's value, and then it pulls the cookie out by getting its substring, decodes it, and returns the value to whatever function called it. We saw that in the last video as well in more detail. We have the delete cookie function, which basically takes the name of whatever cookie we want and sets its max age to 0, which effectively deletes the cookie. And then we have our document.ready. So this is where these functions are going to get called. First of all, we're using the location object and its protocol to see if the protocol for this URL starts with HTTP. So we looked at the location object in the first video from this chapter. So we're actually looking at the protocol, see if it starts with HTTP. If it doesn't, that's when we're going to pop up that message and says, hey, this application only works when it's on a web server. If you run it from a file on your computer, it's going to say file : and it won't run properly. All right, let's look at this. When somebody clicks the add task button, this is the click event that will run. The first thing it's going to do is go find our task box, which was a text box. We're getting a reference to the text box, and then we're pulling the value out of that text box and storing it in this constant called task. Okay. Now we're going to do some testing. Let's make sure they actually typed in a task. So if task is set to empty, an empty string, double quotes here, we're going to pop up an alert box and send them right back to that text box to type in something. If there is something typed in there, we're going to call get cookie by name, and we want to get the tasks cookie because that's where everything is stored at, is in this tasks cookie on our computer. And then what we're going to do is take the current tasks that were stored on our computer in that cookie, and we're going to concatenate the task that was typed in that task box and a new line character onto the end of that cookie, onto the end of the cookie's value. All right, so we've just added a new task with a new line at the end of it. All right, then once we modified that cookie, we're going to set the cookie tasks again, including the tasks that we just reset, and we're going to update it for 21 more days from now. So the cookie will persist from 21 days from the last time somebody pushed the add task button. Okay, so once that cookie is all set on our computer, the tasks have been added, we're going to clear out that text box. We're also going to log that to our console. So we could actually go to the console and look at the log of those tasks. And then we're going to call get cookie by name tasks to get the value of the cookie again and set task list, which was that big text box area, to the value that is stored in the tasks. So it gets all that whole list with all the new line characters and everything. And this actually updates the display. Remember, up here, we're updating the cookie. Down here, we're taking the cookie again and updating the display with it. And we have the clear task button, which basically calls the delete cookie and deletes all the tasks, sets that time to 0 so that that task gets deleted and clears out all the boxes. And that's how the task list application stores our tasks locally on our computer using a cookie. One last thing I want to show you on this. Let's pull this over here. Let me create a couple tasks. Let's do clean the house again. And I'll add that task in. Now, let me pull up the F12 tool. So I'm going to hit F12, and let's look at our console. I can see right there, my console says task : clean the house. Remember, we logged that to the console in that script. It was logging it to the console. So let me clear the console and let me cut the grass. I'll add that task. And now my tasks contents say tasks, clean the house, cut the grass. So we can see that being logged to the console so that we can see what it looks like. But even if you're not logging it to the console, you can see the properties of your cookies. So once you have the F12 tools pulled up, you can run along the top here and you're looking for application. Okay, so you're looking for the application window. If you don't see it up here, click the double arrows and see if it's over here on the right side. So if this is set smaller, I might not see application. I might have to use the pull down menu. But we want to click on application, and then no matter where you're at here, local storage, we're going to probably be looking at that later, or maybe session storage. We might be looking at that, but what we want to look at right now, because we're using cookies, is click on this. This was my website, mrgeiger.com, that we were using, and you can see my task cookie right here, and we can see its value. I have my font set really big, so this is, but that's for display purposes for the video. So I can see that task cookie by coming in here and looking at my cookies. The value for tasks is set to clean the house. It's got a new line character, and then cut the grass with another character. Remember, these are encoded by that encode URI and decode URI function every time we save or load them. But this is a good place for you to cut your cookies. We can see the domain set to there, the path is set to that, and I can see when it expires. It expires, if I can pull my 2023 05/10 probably, whatever 21 days from today is. That's going to be different depending on what day you're running this application. Hopefully you try to run it yourself. But set your screen back to a realistic size, and you can see a little bit more information, although it might have just disappeared in the video because it even has a time on there. Time 23:55. That's probably UTC time because it's not that late here right now. So that's a good way to troubleshoot and test your cookies, is use the application tab of the F12 tools and go to cookies. Later on, when we're talking about local storage and session storage, you might want to use these two to troubleshoot your application.